Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I am very fortunate. I get to welcome you to our Guest Artist Explorer series. I did not count what number Corinne is in this series, but notably, when Corinne joined the Foster in January, one of her first ideas was to create this series. I had already launched a series called My Journey with Tony, because I was interested in bringing in people who had traveled with Tony Foster or who had played a role in advancing his career. And Corinne, very quickly, being the Pied Piper that she is, she said, "Oh, I know so many other artist explorers. I would love to create a speaker series about that." So 8 or 9 speakers later, she's managed very appropriately to tuck herself into the lineup. So before I do the formal introduction of Corinne, I would like to ask a question, how many people in this room have followed Corinne somewhere? Has anybody followed Corinne somewhere? So I'd like to argue that Corinne, along with being an artist and an explorer, she's also a Pied Piper. She's one of those people that is so excited about being in nature and so excited about art, and the intersection of those two things and she is interested in chocolate too, which if you don't know that already, you'll learn more about that. But her enthusiasm, her warmth, her enthusiasm, how her eyes light up, her engagement about what she's passionate about turns her naturally, unintentionally, I think, into being a Pied Piper. So I hear stories about people who've been on a hike with Corinne or been to one of her chocolate tastings, and they're so effusive about it. So I know she's going to be sharing some of that enthusiasm with us tonight. So I want to tell you, for those of you, some of the people in the room already know a lot about Corinne, but I'd like to make sure that you know the important facts. So Corinne has worked at the Foster as our managing director here since January and has been a wonderful colleague, and really a huge amount of her effort, other than helping me organize some things a little bit better than, the next chapter of our evolution as an organization, is she's really been doing a wonderful job with outreach into our community and helping people discover the Foster and that we're here, particularly in the art and wilderness community, which is very important to me. Oh, by the way, I'm Jane Woodward, for those of you who haven't met me, and the Foster is my project and adventure that is advancing with all of your help as you tell all your friends that we're here. So back to Corinne. Corinne is an artist, and that includes many categories: photographer, painter, multimedia storyteller, who has enjoyed exploring the world. And I actually didn't realize this about Corinne when I first met her. And reading this, I'm like, wow, I'm a real homebody compared to Corinne. 7 continents, 50 states, 3,000 miles on the Bay Trail. That's a lot. And hundreds of parks and trails. In between her work as a journalist, analyst, editor, manager at technology companies, and naturalist, and now working very hard here at the Foster. Corinne is an advocate of personal research projects and will share photographs and findings from her own research. She's been studying birds and chocolate for most of her life. Interesting combination. You don't meet very many people who can tell that story. And will include a sample of the latter as part of her presentation. She'll also discuss how time in the unfenced and unrectangled world, the natural world, unrectangled natural world, continues to have a profound effect on her life and her art. Now, there's some important people in this room that I'll call on in just a moment, or at least point them out. Corinne was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She and I have that in common. A product of an artist, her mom, who is here, and an engineer, her father, who's a renowned professor at Stanford. And they both loved the outdoors. She grew up in a house where things were always being explored, built, or created. After high school, she left to live in the mountains and study and travel the world. She spent many years behind a desk. Kind of a good contrast there, right? Working for technology companies. All the while, her early experiences with nature, which had left an indelible impression on her life and her art, tugged at her to get back outside. How many people in this room know where Corinne spends her Sunday afternoons? It's out at the Baylands, right? Artistically, Corinne was smitten by landscape painters and photographers, and was also drawn to the wit and the craft of animation and infographics. She's been eating a different chocolate every day for more than 12 years. Think about that, everybody. and has painted with melted chocolate. That's pretty cool. She enjoys being a naturalist and a hiker and taking photos continuously, much to the annoyance of her hiking companions. Corinne has exhibited her photographs in the United States and in Cuba, and her work has appeared in books, journals, research papers, and is part of several private collections. Please raise your hands and join me in welcoming Corinne DeBra to the stage.
Thank you, Jane. I'm delighted and grateful to be this month's Artist Explorer speaker at the Foster. And thank you to everybody who turned out this evening. I would like to say something first about Artist Explorers in general. I was very excited to start this series because there are so many incredible people in this area that are Artist Explorers, a very high concentration of them. And I see a few of the people in the audience today who have been part of our series. So a special welcome to them, and thank you for being here. Well-known artist explorers include us in their adventures, seducing us with a keen sense of observation and understanding about their destinations. The result is that we're able to experience and feel something new about a place. Tony Foster shares with us wild places that are extraordinary and does so in an extraordinary way. I felt very fortunate to be surrounded and inspired by his work this past year. My sense of place is deeply, as Jane said, rooted in the San Francisco Bay Area, and growing up in this place has influenced how I see the world, including seeing things through chocolate-colored lenses sometimes. So, and I'll be talking a lot about personal research projects, which is kind of my version of Tony's journeys. So I grew up in the Valley of Heart's Delight. Have anybody ever heard this term before? I felt incredibly fortunate to do so, especially the more I look back on it, the more fortunate I feel like. And so my perception and my memories here are this tiny sort of slice of time in between which the natural world was changing. There was a lot of things in technology that were developing, and it was a time where the first man was being sent into space, who also carried the first chocolate being sent into space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. So. Which is how I view history again. There has to be chocolate. Chocolate is a food of explorers. And so the Spanish explorers, when they first came to the New World, were marked in their journals, and you can see the entries there, that these brown beans are great. You can walk all day and not be hungry or thirsty, and we don't know what they are, but they're fantastic. So a lot of explorers have carried chocolate with them to new destinations. As part of this growing up, where fruit trees were turning into freeways, there was perhaps the biggest gift that I received was the freedom to create and explore that I got from growing up with my parents who were here. That's what we did. And at any one time, there was a lot of focus on these projects that were going on in the garage. Just even in the garage, there was things that were being built, like an electric car or a one-man jet or a boat, or there was all kinds of things that were happening. So I didn't understand that this was probably pretty unusual and pretty wonderful, and so I enjoyed the heck out of that. And we were sciencing, the heck out of everything else as well, meaning not so much in the technical sense, but that science was the language of the curious and of the creations that were going on in our house. At any one time, we probably had about 10 or 15 bicycles in the garage, maybe 10 sets of skis, so there was a lot of emphasis on going places. And in the backyard, we were busy building all kinds of things, including very unsafe roller coasters out of boards and wagons. In other words, all things that would be probably frowned on today, but as part of our free-range childhood, where we could hop over the fence and play in the orchards that were the residual parts of the apricots and the fruit orchards, was a wonderful place. Indoors was a place you just kind of spent a limited amount of time to go. You went to refuel and plan your next project. So these are my equivalent of my souvenirs from my childhood. So I was influenced by comic books and graphic arts, and I still use this Sea Monkeys magnifying glass, I'll have to know, every day. But I was fascinated with cameras and ads for cameras in the back of comic books, and I wanted to be a National Geographic photographer. That was my childhood dream. I was seeing wonderful photographs, and then, much to my amazement, found out years later that I am distantly related to the two people here. And so Bradford Washburn and his wife were mountain climbers and early explorers, and probably most significantly aerial photographers. So that was pretty fun to find that out later. So personal research projects, I'm going to focus on just a few of them. The one that Jane sort of alluded to before was I've been eating a different chocolate every day for over 12 years and chronicling that and featuring a new chocolate on my site, which is called Chocolate Banquet. So that's about 4,500 chocolates. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then I'll also talk about walking the bay, which is where I took a couple 1,000-mile walks around what was the Bay Trail that was being developed at that time. So the personal research project started when I was very young. When I was 7, my parents went backpacking frequently and camping in the mountains. And at some point, we were somewhere north of the Donner Pass, about where that red X is up there. There was a little game of hide and go seek that got out of control, and 3 sisters ended up farther away from their parents and basically got lost. So my 2 sisters sat down, cried, and didn't move. That was a smart thing to do. I was sure that I knew where I was going, and so I just kept walking and walking, and then started having such a great time that I just kept walking and walking, and it turns out I probably walked about 5 or 6 miles, and then figured out I was having, again, such a great time, that I was smelling the pine cones and just, having a wonderful time. And then it finally occurred to me that, maybe I better think about, maybe this was not such a thing that I should start thinking about maybe getting back. So luckily, this is where being in a family where things were observed and enjoyed, and I was watching the clouds and I was watching the trees, and I was able to figure out from the direction that the clouds were moving that how to retrace my steps and go back where I came. And so I had just spent so much time in nature that it felt so natural to kind of read things that way. And eventually, when I walked back at least 1.5 miles or so, I heard my dad calling my name, and we reconnected. And again, I had such a great time. I never felt fearful or in danger or anything else. My mom, who very wisely was upset at me, didn't talk to me for a few days, and I probably got some trail mix or a Hershey's bar or some kind of chocolate at the end of that adventure. But I loved being in nature. I always did. So I also kind of conducted my own little personal research projects when I was about 9 years old, and when we spent time at the ocean, at the beach. I loved looking at shells and things up close, like this abalone shell, which I took a picture of later in years, and loved going out body surfing way beyond where the waves were breaking. The little souvenir in the upper right corner is a square of cocoa butter. We were sometimes given 50 cents, and here spend a couple of hours down at the beach so that you could buy these little squares of cocoa butter, and people slathered that on them instead of sunscreen. Smelled great. And this was before the movie Jaws came out, so you were out in the water and no fears at all. And I remember being out there one day, and all of a sudden a helicopter was kind of flying, and it got closer and closer, and I thought, oh, wow, I wonder what it's doing. And all of a sudden it stopped over me and said, get back into shore now, and you were too far out. So again, the comfort that I felt in nature was probably borderline, a little bit too much, but I survived, and so did everybody else in my family, despite the fact that we were all explorers of one type or another. So, and this is sort of the beginning, since I was really fascinated with illustrations and 2D graphic art and comic books. This was after I had been sort of studying, this is last century, in making a little painting about sea stars and sea creatures. So then, just fast forwarding about 40 years, I spent a lot of time in the technology industry. When I came back here, I started my career in energy and environment, and then came back to the Bay Area. Had a wonderful time. There was lots of real life science, but not a lot of nature and art. And so there was a lot of life behind a contracting rectangle. so that, the screens of all different sizes. And so I realized when I had a chance one day to go out and take a picture like this that, wow, I really missed being outside. So about that time, I started Chocolate Banquet, and I really felt like I needed to have like a daily commitment, to something that would get me outside. Maybe it would be yoga or meditation. And at that point, my daughter walked through the room, and she was listening to me ponder out loud, and she said, Mom, you love chocolate. Why don't you just eat a different chocolate every day for a year? And I thought, that I could do. So for the last 12 years, every trip has turned into a chocolate field trip, and so I have had the great pleasure and privilege to travel. So, for example, to go to Nicaragua, the picture to the far left is in Nicaragua in happier days before there's, I think it's not so easy right now there, but to be able to sort of be in that sense of place where there was a lot of volcanic soils, and that you got a chance to talk with the farmers and see where the trees were growing, and you got a chance to taste the fruit, and you had a chance to see it all from scratch in being made ultimately into a bar, which is something that we would see at stores. But was really meaningful. So my personal research projects, like Tony's Journeys, the value to me is they're very direct, they're very experiential. It's not like reading things in a book. And to me, that's the best way to really learn. And to try to share that with other people has been part of what makes it fun for me. So again, nature, science, and chocolate, these sort of reoccurring themes and, perspective. So to get into some facts and some figures, and so we can't mention the word science without doing that a little bit. So this is about the average pounds per year consumption for chocolate. Switzerland is generally considered the country with the highest consumption of chocolate. There's where I am. So the math on that is, again, what I mentioned. Probably it's closer to 24 to 25 pounds a year. And in case you were curious, over a period of 12 years, that's 4,500 chocolates from 1,377 companies. That's about 281 pounds or 127 kilograms of chocolate, if you were to put it all in one room, and representing about 673,000 plus calories, with about 358 different inclusions or different kinds of food, fruit, nuts, things like that combined with chocolate. Since chocolate's pretty universal, it's easy to find things that match with it. From representing chocolate being made in about 57 different countries. So the science of chocolate gets very deep and very technical very quickly. These trees, the Theobroma cacao tree, which means food of the gods, it also is a very complex tree, which came on the scene about 10 million years ago, which is relatively recent. Our coastal redwoods probably first appeared about 65 million years ago. And humans would have intersected with cacao trees probably about 4,000 years ago. And so there is a long tradition of cacao in the Americas, which is where it started, where it came from. So I read somewhere that it contains approximately 800 chemical compounds. So that's a lot. One of the reasons why people like chocolate is because it is full of good minerals, and it's got non-dimides, which are chemicals that make you feel good. It's got a mild stimulant called theobromine, very similar to caffeine, only it has a different effect on different people. There is a small amount of caffeine, but most of the uplift that you get is from something called theobromine, which we co-evolved, like with other plant alkaloids, to be able to kind of enjoy, as opposed to the plant's original intent, which is to try to keep predators away from eating the plant. Somehow we managed to co-evolve and defeat that. So anyway, we could talk all night about the technical aspects of chocolate, but the people that get into making chocolate from scratch tend to be very technical people. So there's a nuclear physicist I know, software developers, the engineers of different types. So it's one of those things, like a lot of craft foods, where you can really go very, very deep on this. So, and there's also the art of chocolate. So this is one of the chocolate paintings that I did that Jane was mentioning. So Tony uses professional Winsor & Newton watercolors, and I use Michael Misher chocolate, craft chocolate from Oakland with sea salt, which helps preserve the chocolate. And then I occasionally get involved with other projects. So the photograph on the right here is of someone who is, they had created a photo shoot and they were using chocolate wrappers and food wrappers and other things to create something kind of fun and different. So my next personal research project was walking the bay, which I decided to, and I was one of the people I was with that when I made this decision to do this is sitting right here, and may remember that conversation that even though I was working full-time, you know, that I could do maybe walking the bay in segments, and that there was something called the Bay Trail, and that you could take, essentially, in the way it was aligned then, about a 1,000-mile walk around the bay. So I decided to do that in sections. So the green line, and I have a couple of maps here, it's all available online on thebaytrail.org. This is a trail that's been in the works for almost 30 years, and so it's now that people are sort of knowing about it, it's what I would call a 30-year overnight success story. A lot of hard work by a lot of people to put this together, but it's a really wonderful, it's a wonderful trail system. I highly recommend checking it out. The other thing that was really remarkable is that it was just an incredible, embarrassing realization at how much nature that you could find intermingled between in the 9 counties and 47 cities, and this kind of strip that was in between a really highly developed area, and to see that the residual bird populations and the nature that was, the wildlife that was thriving there, to see how adaptable they were and how they'd survived was really phenomenal to me. So this is, I tried to travel in a way that was very lightweight. I didn't want to carry a tripod. I didn't want to call attention to myself, so it was like a 1-ounce nylon bag from Piazza's, and there's a lot of logbooks and maps. And then those are a pair of shoes that subsequently I ended up getting, having to go walk through the mud in the Baylands and got totally trashed. I went through, I think, 9 pairs of shoes during the time that I did this. And I photographed and tracked lots of wildlife birds, what numbers of different species I saw. And I also included some found objects in that, like balls in the bay. And so like baseballs, basketballs, footballs, every sport was represented. And once balls go down the streams and get into the bay, they're there for a long time. And so it was kind of interesting to track that. And of course, many pounds of chocolate were consumed. So one of the things as an artist that I was drawn to is that the Bay Trail is that interface between, it's a boundary, it's a border between water and land, and there's a lot of life and things that are happening between those two places. So you've got a nature-urban border, you've got a land and water border, and kind of a science and art angle as well. So I also was drawn to, so this is a picture on the right of an example of a bird and just how adaptable and flexible they can be. But the picture on the left shows that what I was really drawn to, even though I was getting a lot of pictures of very representative art, is that I was kind of drawn to romantic painters, romantic photographs, romantic landscapes, and things like this where there was an algae bloom and it looked like a Monet painting. So this was over in the Coyote Hills. And I found myself, I was just taking lots of pictures of, like California poppies and fruits and bloom and, amazing, sort of residual little agriculture and wildlife strips. And I realized later that what I was doing was I was recreating the Valley of Heart's Delight. I mean, this was what my childhood had been, all my fondest memories were all about. And I was inadvertently kind of like gravitating towards all those little things. This is a postcard by Stanley Piltz, who was famous for mid-century modern kind of scenes like this. So I did get some coverage when I was doing this, and I was interviewed by Doug McConnell, who's a wonderful person. And my whole evil plan was to try to promote the Bay Trail to let more people know about it. And so I was able to do that through this walk. And then I also sort of became an accidental field biologist. A few years ago, after we had the heavy rain, there was a lot of die-offs going on with leopard sharks and rays and fish, and they were trying to figure out what was going on. And I just happened to be walking at a few places where I saw some of these sharks that were really having a tough time, and it was obvious to me that they weren't just fishing in shallow waters. So I stopped for an hour or two and took a lot of pictures of the couple of different days where this was happening, and then hooked up with a wildlife field biologist, and they used some of my photos and field descriptions in when they were trying to diagnose what was happening. One of the picture on the left, I think, was in the San Jose Mercury, and I had National Geographic call me to find out whether they could use my photos in something that they were doing. So my dream, I'm a National Geographic photographer, right? However, I found out that it was an intern who called me. They wanted to do it for Shark Week. And I just was not excited about that, because these particular sharks that are in the bay are some of the most docile sharks that you can imagine. So I don't think that was ever used, because I was not really excited about that, I guess. One of the big bonuses is that, there are lots of birds out at the Baylands, and so this really got me reconnected with birds' life in a real way. My current projects include trying to see all the parks in the East Bay Regional Park System. Again, highly recommend going and visiting that park system if you haven't already been there. They have a great series of shoreline parks, but they also have a pretty amazing list of parks. This is really, I think, the most extensive kind of regional park system like this in the country, and it seems to be growing all the time, so they really have a lot of support behind it, these two counties. The most recent trip that I went on, and not all of these parks are accessible, just you can't, some of them require guides or signing up ahead of time, and there's limited access. And so I went with someone else who's sitting in the audience. We got an advanced, we had tried to sign up for kayaking here multiple times, and we're foiled by weather, and so there's a boat that actually leaves from Berkeley, and we were able to take that. And so this is a hatchet-shaped island that's one of the larger islands in the bay that is off of Richmond. And as we were making our way around the spit that you can see that in the photo to the left, everyone was so excited about seeing these black oyster catchers here that the boat ran into a buoy, and the raft that we were all going to use to go out on the island floated loose. So fortunately, we were able to, and that's a picture of the raft that was subsequently captured, and people got back to it. So it was a wonderful day on that island, and it was, we walked around it, and the geology and the history and the species that were there were amazing. So then there was this huge racket when we got ready to leave. The boat was stirring up a lot of mud, and we saw this kingfisher that was upset. And this is where, if you're studying any kind of, whether it's your pet or any kind of living creature, the longer you study it and observe it, you really start to pick up what's going on with it. So it was pretty upset because it had been fishing there, and we were mucking up the waters. And so the other projects that I am involved with is light research from natural resources. And so this is an example of a scorpion that's lit up with a UV light, and it looks like a piece of turquoise. And so I don't know, have any of you gone into the desert and gone hunting and used that technique to spot scorpions? Yeah, and along with certain minerals. So it's also, if you put a black light and you're drinking your gin and tonic, the tonic water will fluoresce as well. So there's lots of different things that are just beyond our normal field of vision. And then I really got into close-ups with shooting bird eyes for a while too. And I also got, I thought with the hummingbird, I was really curious to see if I could get a shot without taking a video camera or anything of a hummingbird that is actually blinking. And so this is like, I went through many, many pictures and eventually found one where the hummingbird was blinking. And So that's really it. That's a really quick run through a couple of personal research projects. So it's hard. I overshot and had probably about 150,000 photographs to choose from, and so I just thought I would show some that I hadn't shown before. So I would highly recommend going and checking out the Bay Trail for people that haven't already been there. And I wanted to say thank you to all of the staff here, to Jane, to the Foster, to Charles and our AV crew who are making sure that this presentation went smoothly, and to the artist explorers that have been part of this series, and a couple of them again are in this room. I would highly recommend checking out our next two artist explorers. We've got Megan Walla-Murphy, who's an animal tracker, that will speak on January 22nd, and we have Linda Gass, who will be here February 5th. So thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your being here.